Well, good morning, church. Today we finish our mini-series on exploring the name of God and specifically what his name Yahweh reveals about his character in Exodus chapter 34 verses 6 and 7. And this is what the NIV says. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name Yahweh. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parent to the third and fourth generation. Now, I have loved the sermons that we've had in this series. It's been so good to see the emerging leaders presenting and hearing from them. And I've loved the challenges that have come out of each and every one of them. We had Ruth at the start talking about the fact that God reveals his name. That this amazing revelation that God has a name, that he is a real and he's living and he is desperate for a real and active relationship with you and me. And that was fantastic. And then Vicky had a really challenging talk, I think, but she did a fantastic job talking about God among gods and with the small g. And it was so good to be reminded of this spiritual realm, but also the fact that our God is the Creator God and he is the Lord of Lords and above all else. Graham talked to us about God's compassion and mercy. And in the Hebrew, when we're looking through and reading these two passages, it's weighted the most important aspects of God's character. They're all important, but the most prominent ones sit at the front of this. So this idea that God's compassion and mercy is the core of his character. It's above all else in him. And our God is compassionate and gracious and merciful to us. And that was just a fantastic reminder and challenge for how then we respond to that outwardly to the people around us. Becky reminded us that God is slow to anger, but that he does get angry. It's not his default position, and it takes a lot for him to get angry, but he does get angry. And there is a need for us to come to our Father with a healthy fear, I think. And finally, Rob spoke last week about God's unfailing love and faithfulness. And he translated it beautifully. He said, God's boundless, relentless, loyal love. And he gave us that picture of a relationship, and not a totalitarian God with rules for no reason that we have to follow and be punished if we fall out of line, but this relationship like a marriage where it has boundaries, where it has rules and consequences. But ultimately is a relationship that is built on closeness and intimacy. And he talked a lot about God crying out for justice and that we are to do the same. Those 5 sermons covered just one verse in the Bible. That was verse 6. And so the ESV summarises it like this. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord Yahweh, the Lord Yahweh. Remember, we take note. In Hebrew, when they repeat 2 words, then it's really emphasizing the importance of it. A God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Which then brings us on to verse 7. And that's right, you get a full verse from me. So sit back, get comfortable. We'll be here for a while. Not just a couple of words though. And boy, what a verse it is. Here we go, in the ESV again. Keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. Whew! I don't know who picked these topics. I don't know who gave me this one, but thank you. But you know, one of the reasons I've loved this series is because it's really good to be challenged. And it's been a really good reminder for us to reground and refocus our thoughts on God and who He says and what He says He is. And we have to do it, and we have to do it constantly, because it's so easy to fall into the trap where we shape God into our image rather than letting Him shape us into His image. I'm going to repeat that because I think it's really important. We fall into the trap very easily that we shape God into our image rather than letting Him shape us into His image. So when we come across a challenging verse like this, we need to stop and we need to pause. My home group know that I like to repeat myself a lot. My home group know that I like to repeat myself, but one of the things that I say is that we are called to wrestle with the Bible. And if we hold the Bible with any kind of authority and respect, we cannot gloss over these passages, and certainly not when we are being given a glimpse of our Father, the Creator, the Lord Almighty. Jesus took these scriptures very seriously, and so we are to do the same. And so we need to chew over them, we need to think on them, we need to pray into them, and we need to wrestle with them, and we need to pray that we come out changed the other side. So, let's wrestle. So, we begin with a pretty solid start to this verse. God is maintaining love to thousands. I can get on board with this. We're in a comfortable place with this. We've already heard a lot about God's love already in the sermon series, but the difference in this little element here is that God is maintaining it. He is steadfast. The Hebrew here is talking really about God protecting and guarding His love for us. But it's a love that's not just for the select few or a select group. Some translations will say that He's maintaining love to thousands, and others will say that He's maintaining love to thousands of generations. It's not a literal thing about how many. The point here is that it's hyperbole, so it's that God's love is limitless. Okay? So when we read that God so loved the world, He gave His one and only Son, His love is available to His creation, not just you and me. It's an open invite, and God's got enough love for all of us, if we choose it. Okay, next we read that God is forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. And the aim of this trilogy, really, of words is it's trying to encompass absolutely everything that we can do wrong. Okay? Whether it's bad behaviour to one another, whether it's against God, there's a legal aspect in there that's covering kind of the breaking the law, either the human laws or the spiritual and the divine laws that we've been given, or just in any way that we can fall short of what God intended for us. It's a kind of catch-all for everything. And so this is the point of this section of the verse. God can forgive sins of all shapes and sizes. And it's in God's nature to want to forgive. This is His character. Okay? And I think the best way to kind of emphasize and shape this is through one of the parables that Jesus gave us. And if we think of the parable of the prodigal son in Luke, as the son repents and comes home to the father is waiting. He is looking out for him. And on seeing his son's return, he bounds down the road to greet him and accept him. It's in God's character. It is who He is. It is inbuilt into Him to want to strive to forgive our sins, to forgive iniquity and transgression and sin. And again, this just part of this is just an absolutely fantastic reminder of God and His nature. But then as we start to read on in the verse, it maybe gets a little bit more uncomfortable. We all want justice in our hearts and the pit of our stomach when we look at the news and see the horrific things that we are doing to one another. People being manipulated, people being ignored. The poor are getting poorer as the rich become richer. People are forgotten. We are seeing children used and abused, people trafficked, and the innocent downtrodden and hurt. We feel it in our souls, and you feel that cry that this isn't fair and this isn't right. And we want justice. And I think it's because we know that this isn't what God intended the world to be like. And so it's good and right that we read that God will by no means clear the guilty. Ultimately, there are those people who have quietened their consciences for so long that they just can't hear them anymore, and they will refuse to recognise that they're doing anything wrong. And then there are people who will just revel in their lifestyles and the debauchery and not care. God's astounding grace and mercy isn't just a free pass to do whatever we want. You know, we have such an emphasis in these early parts of it, of these verses, and they're so important, this compassion, grace and mercy from our Father. But you can't just do what you want and get away with it. He will by no means clear the guilty. And then we read in Romans, Paul tells us that we have all sinned and that we have all fallen short of the glory of God. And so you feel this kind of fear and this desperate uncomfortableness when we read about this idea that the guilty can't be cleared. But this is when we start to get to the good news, because we look back on what we've just read and we know that our Father is forgiving at his core. We don't have to come with him with dread because of Jesus. We have to come to him recognizing our transgressions and our sins and the fact that we have fallen so short. But if we recognize them, if we recognize our shortcomings, Jesus takes them straight onto his shoulders and he takes them straight to the cross. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Jesus in a bit, but as we continue reading through these verses, we find ourselves getting a little bit even more unsettled, because we finish with this. The ESV translation says this: visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. The NIV is even more blunt. God punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. And we just have to ask ourselves, what is going on here? What is this all about? Because it sounds to me, on the face value of reading that we have a vindictive God who punishes kids, for what their parents have done. And that doesn't seem fair. That's unfair. That seems unfair, and it feels unjust. From the outset, we need to say that a straight reading of the English translation of this, I don't think does this justice at all. And actually we see in other parts of the Bible God making the exact opposite point explicitly. So in Deuteronomy it says this: parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children to be put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sins. Okay? So, we have to ask ourselves what on earth is going on here. And I think what I've found a little bit helpful is to read Jeremiah's version of these words from Exodus. And this is what Jeremiah 32 says in the NIV, from chapter 32 from verse 18. You show love to thousands, but bring punishment for the parents' sins into the laps of their children after them. Great and mighty God, whose name is the Lord Almighty, Yahweh. Great are your purposes, and mighty are your deeds. Your eyes are open to the ways of all mankind. You reward each person according to their conduct and as their deeds deserve. Jeremiah is undoubtedly using the Exodus, reworking those words in Exodus as we see throughout the Bible as it re-quotes these. But he's also saying categorically again that God rewards each person to their conduct and as their deeds deserves. And then he has this interesting turn of phrase, which I think is quite helpful, that the parents' sin is brought to the laps of the children after them. It's brought before them. Okay? So it's time to wrestle. Firstly, I think what this part of this verse means is that we're being told that the sin of the parents has a consequence for the children. And I don't think anyone would disagree with that. That makes sense. We know that to be true in our deeds and actions with our children and those around us. So to take it to an extreme though, if I go and rob my local co-op and I get sent to jail, I am being punished for what I have done. But, and importantly, my daughters are not being punished for what I have done. But there will undoubtedly be an impact, a consequence from what I have done on their lives. That we have been torn apart as a family. We are no longer whole. That I am missing, and it's going to put hardship and struggle and undue distress because of my absence and because of the consequence and legacy of what I've done through that punishment then afterwards. Okay? So there are consequences for our actions and they impact those around us. And we see this in the story of Exodus that surrounds the verses that we're looking at. The generation of Israelites that rebelled against God and rejected God were punished. And their punishment was that they were not going to see the promised land. Okay? Now, God, because his grace and mercy abounds, forgave those people of their rebellion. Moses intercedes on their behalf, and it's an amazing story that's well worth you going back and read in Exodus. But they are forgiven, but there is a consequence for what they've done. They will not be able to see the promised land, and there is also a consequence for the children. Even though they're not being punished, the children had to deal with the consequence of their actions by struggling in the desert for 40 more years until they then were allowed to enter the promised land. Does that make sense? So, the things that we do have consequences for our children. Secondly, I think this verse is telling us a little bit about God's faithfulness and his justness. The same wording from Exodus occurs earlier in Exodus when we are given the 10 commandments, and it says this: you shall not bow down to them or serve them. And God's talking about false idols here. For I, the Lord your God, Yahweh, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. The truth is that we know that things run in the family. And I see it in my children. Sometimes I get a glimpse of some of my better parts in them, and it's a wonderful experience. But other times, and there's no real worse feeling, you get a glimpse of your bad habits and your poor tendencies, and your attitudes echoed in your children. And you cringe and you just see yourself and you hear yourself, and it breaks you. And what we do around our children and around those around us influences and shapes them. And if we think back to that quote in the Ten Commandments, then ultimately the chances are, if your mum and dad were idol worshippers, then you will be too. And I think part of this element of this verse is that just because your dad or your mum and dad have been punished for their idolatry doesn't mean you will get left off the hook. Does that make sense? So God is faithful in his justness, and that if you continue that idolatry or that sinful nature that you've inherited and learned from your parents, then you also will be liable for punishment and dealing with the consequence of that. Just because your mum and dad have been punished doesn't mean that you get let off. Okay? So as they say, like father, like son. One of the things that struck me as I was reading and thinking about this on a side note is how much this emphasises the importance of how we look after our children and the responsibility that we have, not just for our own children but for the children of our community, in our Sunday schools, in our homes, but in our outreach that we do in Holy Trinity and with the school and with the college. We have a vitally important role to play in helping shape and influence their lives, because we can say, like father, like son, but ultimately it's desperately important that we remember that we have two fathers, and one of them is a holy father who is all-powerful and is desperate to forgive, and we are called to be his character, and we are called to be him in this world. Does that make sense? Okay, this last bit's important, so let's talk about Jesus. Verse 7 of what we're looking at is poetry. We've got to understand that it is poetic, and I mean, what I mean by that is that the first element is echoed at the end, and there is a waiting to verse 7. So listen to again as I read it to you. God is maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of their parents to the third and fourth. Do you hear that? Do you see that? Thousands, third and fourth. Yeah, we have an amazing God. And what we're saying here is that the steadfast love of God is limitless, 1,000 generations. But sin and the consequences can be limited, okay? Our Father has the power to break these cycles of sin, but the love is limitless. I think that's fantastic. We've already seen that the guilty will not go unpunished. And we know that we are all sinners, but what we see as we move towards the New Testament is the ultimate fruition of God's character, his love and grace and mercy in the embodiment of Jesus. God is just. There are consequences and there is a need for punishment when we are guilty. But we have this tension in the verses of that justice with that overwhelming mercy and that forgiving character. And it's brought to a head in the life and the death of Jesus, where we, as sinners, turning from our sin and recognizing our bad ways, can go to our Father and seek forgiveness from a willing God and Jesus who will take those shortcomings and those failures to the cross for us on our behalf. It is justice, but it's God making a way through himself to unleash his grace and his compassion and his love. There has to be justice, but he finds a way through Jesus. And one thing that I just think is really important as we kind of draw our thoughts to a close on this really packed verse is that this isn't a caricature of a mean and vindictive God who is set out for blood, and Jesus as a victim, and the vulnerable the vulnerable victim. We aren't seeing here like two polar opposites. This is God and Jesus who are the same, working together to bring mercy and justice on that cross, absorbing the world's sin and the evil that we have created in Jesus' death, and then magnificently bringing life and bringing freedom through the resurrection. And that's the good news. And just let that penetrate your soul. Let that resonate with you. It is amazing. God's character is consistent. He is consistent and faithful. He is faithful in his love and his mercy, and he's consistent and faithful in his need for justice. But he brings this all to a head in Jesus, that wonderful embodiment of the character of God. And on that cross, we are freed. And sin bounds us and binds us and stops us living the life that God wants for us, an amazing, fruitful, wonderful life. But on that cross, they absorb the sin and the evil that we've created, and in Jesus' death, they are taken from us as far as the east is from the west. The slate is wiped clean in Jesus. And then we have this wonderful promise of release, of life, and of freedom in that resurrection. And that's just amazing. There we have it. We've talked a lot today about a lot of things. There is a huge amount in one verse, and those two verses together, over the last 6 weeks, what we've covered it's a lot to take in, but it's so important. And so I just want to encourage you to take some time to read and reread and read Exodus and to think and read around this subject, because we have an amazing God, a very real God who wants a very real relationship and desperately wants the best for each and every one of us, and knows what is best for each and every one of us, and is filled with love and compassion and mercy for us, his creation. And my prayer throughout this series and continuing into the future is really that we keep focusing on God and his character and seek to be shaped more into his image rather than trying to shape God into our own image. That really is the core of the challenge that we have individually, but I think as a church going forward. And I'm excited to see what he's going to do with us as we look to him and to lean on him. The fantastic thing is we don't have to do any of this by ourselves. Our job is to recognize our shortcomings and turn to him, and to seek his forgiveness and to seek his face. But he has given us the Spirit as well to encourage us, to strengthen us, to lead us and to guide us. And we are not alone in this. God is for us, not against us, and wants us, and he's cheering us on. Okay? And as we close this kind of mini series that we've done over this summer, looking at the character of God, I'm really excited that we're actually going to continue looking at the character of God, and we're going to, not next week, but the week after, we're going to start a series looking at the book of Hebrews. God's character is revealed in Exodus, and we can learn so much from it, but he's faithful and consistent, and Jesus is the embodiment of that character. And Hebrews is all about Jesus, and it's all about who he is and why he's greater than everyone else and why he's the Lord of Lords. And so I'm super excited to start that journey with you guys and looking at that. And I'm going to leave you with this from Hebrews 1. It says this: the Son radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God. And Jesus sustains everything by the mighty power of his command. So, can't wait to take that journey with you. Love you guys, miss you, can't wait to see you hopefully soon. But for now, take care and God bless.